Where would you expect to find the savior of the world? In Rome, the capital of the most powerful empire on earth, where senators debated in marble forums and armies marched under triumphal arches. In Jerusalem, the holy city where the very temple of God rose in white stone and gold, drawing pilgrims from every nation. In Alexandria, the Egyptian metropolis with its legendary library and 500,000 inhabitants. He grew up in a village so irrelevant that it doesn't even appear on ancient maps, so small that historians ignored it completely, so despised that whenever someone mentioned its name, the response was always the same. Can anything good come from Nazareth? But it was exactly in this forgotten place, in these streets of dust and limestone, among simple houses and twisted olive trees, that the impossible happened. For 30 years, the creator of the universe lived there in silence, molded by the warm winds of Galilee and the calloused hands of a carpenter. And today, after 2,000 years, every stone of that place still holds secrets that can transform everything you think you know about faith, history, and the power of the insignificant. This is the story of Nazareth, the city that the world despised and that God chose. Imagine you are in Rome in the year 33 of our era. You are an educated, literate scribe with access to the empire's best maps and documents. Before you is a vast scroll listing all the important cities of Judea. Jerusalem is there, obviously. Jericho, Caesarea, Capernaum, Bethsaida. You look for Nazareth. You take the writings of Flavius Josephus, the most important Jewish historian of the time, who meticulously catalogued every village in Galilee. He lists 45 cities and villages. Nazareth is not among them. It's as if it didn't exist. You return to the Old Testament, to the Holy Scriptures that mention hundreds of places. Nazareth, absolute silence. Not a single reference in all the prophetic, historical, and poetic texts that make up the Hebrew Bible. How is it possible that the Messiah, awaited for centuries, announced by prophets, descendant of the royal line of David, grew up in a place that didn't even deserve a line in the historical records? The answer is hidden in exactly that, in the forgetting itself. Because God does not work as we expect. He does not choose palaces when he can choose stables. He does not choose the obvious when he can reveal his glory in the despised. And Nazareth, with its perhaps 200 or 300 souls, was the perfect embodiment of the principle that runs through the entire Bible. God exalts the humble and humbles the proud. But here is the detail most people don't realize. The name Nazareth is not just a geographic accident. It is a prophecy hidden in Hebrew syllables. The word comes from netzer, sprout, shoot, a young branch that buds from a seemingly dead trunk. Now pay attention to this. 700 years before Jesus was born, the prophet Isaiah wrote one of the most powerful prophecies about the Messiah. A shoot shall come out from the stump of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots. Jesse was the father of David. The Davidic dynasty, which had ruled Israel with glory and power, was destroyed. The trunk was cut down. The royal lineage seemed dead, but from the dead root, something would sprout, a netzer, an impossible shoot. And where did this shoot grow? In Nazareth, in the city of the netzer. Can you see what God was doing? He was writing prophecy into the very geography. Every time someone said Jesus of Nazareth, they were declaring, without knowing it, that he was the netzer, the prophesied sprout, the new growth that would bring life from where there was only death. But the name carries even more meanings. Some scholars connect Nazareth to Natsar, to guard, to protect, to watch, like a watchtower, an outpost built on high ground. And indeed, Nazareth sits on an elevation, a place from which one can observe the Jezreel Valley stretching to the horizon, a place of vigilance. Others see the root Nazir, consecrated, set apart for God. The Nazarites were men and women who took special vows of total dedication to the Lord. Samson was a Nazarite. Samuel was a Nazirite, and although Jesus was not technically a Nazirite according to the rules of Numbers chapter 6, he was absolutely set apart, consecrated, different from all men who have ever walked the earth. Three meanings interwoven into a single name: the prophesied shoot, the vigilant guardian, the set-apart, consecrated one, and all this happening in a village that the world considered irrelevant. For nearly 2,000 years, skeptics used the historical silence about Nazareth as an argument. If Jesus really came from there, they said, why does no ancient historian mention this place? Perhaps the whole story is made up. Until the earth began to speak, the year 2009. A team of Israeli archaeologists is working in Nazareth, preparing the ground for the construction of the Mary of Nazareth International Center. Excavators remove layers of earth and sediment accumulated over millennia. And then, 20 feet below the level of the modern street, they find something extraordinary. Not just any house, a house from the 1st century AD, from the time of Jesus. Stop for a moment and think about what this means. You are looking at walls that were standing when Jesus walked the streets of Nazareth. Stones that perhaps his hands touched. Spaces where ordinary people, carpenters, weavers, farmers, lived their daily lives while God was among them. The house is typical of Galilean constructions of the period. Walls of local limestone, plastered with mud and straw mortar, beaten earth floor. A central courtyard where the family worked, cooked, lived, and the most fascinating detail, part of the house was excavated directly into the living rock of the hillside. Why does this matter? Because Jesus, growing up in Nazareth, saw this every day. Houses built upon the rock, houses that withstood the winter storms, that sweep across Galilee with biting winds and torrential rains. And years later, when he taught the parable of the wise man who built his house upon the rock, he wasn't creating an abstract metaphor. He was speaking of what he knew, of what he had seen, of what he had lived. Every teaching of Jesus was rooted in concrete experience, in real memories of Nazareth. But the archaeological discovery goes deeper. Yardena Alexandra, the archaeologist who led the excavations, found pottery fragments inside the house, red clay jars for storing water, oil, and grain. Some had finger marks still visible in the mortar, impressions left by hands that worked that clay 2,000 years ago. She also found millstones, the kind used to grind wheat into flour. Imagine the scene. A 1st century Jewish woman, perhaps 25 or 30 years old, standing in the courtyard of her home at dawn. The sun hasn't fully risen, but there's already enough light to work. She places grains of wheat between two circular stones and begins to turn the top stone. The movement is hypnotic, rhythmic. The flour begins to fall, light and fine. This is the bread her family will eat today. That was how they lived in Nazareth, simple lives, marked by the rhythm of the seasons, the harvests, the holy Sabbaths. And Jesus was there, in the midst of it all. But here is the discovery that changed everything. Professor Ken Dark of Cambridge University conducted even more detailed investigations at another site in Nazareth, a site that had a very particular history. Since the 4th century, Christian pilgrims visited a specific house in Nazareth, not just any house, the house where, according to tradition preserved for centuries, Jesus had grown up. Empress Helena, Constantine's mother, visited the site. Byzantine churches were built around it. Later came the Crusaders, who erected their own structures, layers upon layers of history, all centered on a single point. Skeptics said it was just tradition, legend, pious devotion with no historical basis, until Ken Dark began to excavate. Under the Byzantine and Crusader churches, he found the original house. And not only that, he found evidence that this site had been treated as special from very early on. The house had been carefully preserved. Walls had been reinforced. The site was never used for other purposes or destroyed for new construction. Why? Why would a simple house in an insignificant village be preserved with such care? The obvious answer, the answer the early Christians knew, passed down from generation to generation, is that this was the house, the place where God became man, where the eternal Word learned to speak Aramaic, where the Creator of the universe grew up under the care of Mary and Joseph. Think about the magnitude of that. Archaeology cannot prove that Jesus lived in that specific house, but it can prove that from the earliest centuries of Christianity, that site was considered holy enough to be protected, venerated, and marked with churches that outlasted empires. Tradition is older than doubts. Inside that house, as in the other discovery in 2009, there were the same elements. Limestone walls, floors carved into the rock, a central courtyard, a stone water tank, typical Galilean pottery fragments, an olive press nearby because nearly every family in Nazareth grew a few olive trees on the rocky slopes around the village. It was a hard life. First-century Galilee was not a place of comfort. In the summer, the sun burned relentlessly over the shadeless hills. In the winter, the wind cut like a blade through woolen clothes. Families lived in small spaces, perhaps 300 or 400 square feet for an entire family. Privacy did not exist. Everyone slept in the same room, separated only by simple curtains. And there, in that environment, Jesus spent 30 years. Think about that. His public ministry lasted only 3 years, but he lived an entire decade in Nazareth for every year of preaching. Why? What was God doing during that hidden time? He was being human, completely, fully human. Jesus did not materialize as an adult, with a beard and a deep voice, ready to teach. He was born helpless. He had to learn to walk, stumbling over the uneven stones of Nazareth streets. He learned to speak, pronouncing his first words with a child's high-pitched voice. He learned a trade, likely carpentry, spending years mastering how to choose the right wood, how to hold the adze, how to feel the grain of the wood under his fingers. He was truly hungry, truly thirsty, a fatigue that penetrated to his bones after a day of work under the Galilean sun. Why does this matter? Because it means he understands you. When you are exhausted, he knows what exhaustion is, not theoretically, but through lived experience in Nazareth. When you feel invisible, despised, forgotten in a place no one notices, he knows that feeling. He grew up in the city that didn't even appear on the maps. Nazareth taught Jesus about humility, about obscurity, about the eternal value of the things the world considers worthless. And when the time finally came for his ministry to begin, when John the Baptist baptized him in the Jordan and the heavens opened and the Spirit descended like a dove, where did Jesus return? And it was there, in the synagogue of his own town, among people who had known him since childhood, that he publicly announced who he was. But this story, the story of the rejection in Nazareth, of the first miracle in nearby Cana, of the houses on the rock, and the transformation of this forgotten village into a spiritual beacon for millions, this story is not over yet. Because the impossible was just beginning. It was an ordinary Sabbath in Nazareth, or at least it should have been. Families walked through the narrow streets toward the synagogue, as they did every week. Men in their white wool talits with tassels at the corners, fulfilling the commandment of Numbers, chapter 15. Women in modest veils covering their hair, children running between the adults' legs, kicking up small clouds of dust with their bare feet. Jesus was among them. But something had changed. Weeks before, news began to circulate through Galilee. A carpenter from Nazareth was doing extraordinary things. In Capernaum, on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, he had healed a man possessed by unclean spirits. He had cured Peter's mother-in-law of a violent fever. Crowds followed him. Rabbis questioned him. His name was on every lip. And now he was back, at home. The synagogue of Nazareth was not impressive, a rectangular limestone building, perhaps 50 feet long by 25 wide. Stone benches ran along the walls. A wooden cabinet at the back held the sacred Torah scrolls. A few oil lamps provided dim light, as the windows were few and small to keep heat in during winter and coolness in summer. Jesus entered. Every eye turned to him, the head of the synagogue, a man who had known Jesus since he was a boy, who perhaps had taught him the Hebrew alphabet decades ago, offered him the honor of reading the scriptures. It was custom to give this opportunity to respected visitors, to rabbis, and to scholars of the law. Jesus stood up. He accepted the scroll they handed him. It was Isaiah. He unrolled the parchment with care. These scrolls were precious, hand-copied by scribes who dedicated entire lifetimes to preserving every letter. His fingers, calloused by carpentry, found exactly the passage he was looking for, and then he read. His voice was clear, resonating against the stone walls. "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Absolute silence filled the synagogue. Even the children stopped moving. Jesus rolled up the parchment carefully. He gave it back to the attendant, and then he did something no one expected. He did not sit down, as was the custom after the reading. He remained standing. And every eye, every man, every woman, every elder who had seen him grow up was fixed on him. And Jesus said, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." Can you feel the shock of that statement? He didn't say, "One day this will be fulfilled." He didn't say, "God will send someone to do this." He said, "Today, now, here in me." The Messiah prophesied by Isaiah, the anointed one, the liberator, the one who would bring the Jubilee year, the forgiveness of debts, the restoration of all things, was standing before them. And it was Jesus, Joseph's son, the carpenter who repaired plows and built doors, the boy who played in the same streets as their own children. At first, there was wonder. "Is this not Joseph's son?" they whispered to each other. There was pride in their voices. One of Nazareth's own was performing miracles. Perhaps he would do something spectacular there too, in front of everyone. But Jesus knew their hearts, and he did something that cut straight to their pride. He reminded them of two stories from the Old Testament. First, in the days of the prophet Elijah, when there was a terrible drought over Israel for 3 years and 6 months, there were many widows in Israel going hungry. But God sent Elijah not to an Israelite, but to a Phoenician widow in Zarephath, a foreigner, a pagan. Second, in the days of the prophet Elisha, there were many lepers in Israel suffering from that horrible disease that consumed the flesh and banished them from society. But who was healed? Naaman the Syrian, another foreigner. The message was clear and sharp as a knife. God owes you nothing just because you were born in Israel, just because you circumcised your sons, or just because you keep the Sabbath. He blesses those who have faith, not those who have privilege. And Nazareth exploded. The scripture says that all in the synagogue were filled with wrath, not some, all. Admiration turned to fury in seconds. How dared he? How did he have the nerve to compare them to infidels? They were children of Abraham, guardians of the law, and this carpenter, this son of their own village, was saying that filthy Gentiles were more worthy than they. They rose up. They seized Jesus, and they dragged him out of the synagogue. Nazareth sits on an elevation, remember? A hill overlooking the valley. And on the edge of that hill, there is a precipice, a steep drop of limestone rock, perhaps 100 or 130 feet to the valley below. They took him there, with the intention of pushing him over, of killing him. The surrounding crowd was furious, shouting, with faces twisted by rage. Perhaps there were men there who had worked side by side with Jesus on carpentry projects, women who had bought bread from the same baker as Mary, children who had played with him decades ago, and they all wanted to see him dead. But then, and here is one of the most mysterious moments in the Gospels, Jesus simply passed through their midst and went away. How? The scripture does not explain. Perhaps his divine authority momentarily blinded their fury. Perhaps he simply walked with such dignity and purpose that no one dared touch him. Or perhaps it was a silent miracle, invisible, yet absolutely real. What we know is this: it was not his time to die. Not there, not that way. Because there was a much larger plan in motion. Jesus left Nazareth, and the scripture says he could not do many miracles there because of their unbelief. Think of the tragedy of that. The creator of the universe was among them, ready to heal, to deliver, and to transform. But pride, over-familiarity, and the refusal to accept that God could work through the ordinary, all of this blinded them to the extraordinary that was before their eyes. How many blessings did Nazareth lose that day? How many miracles never happened because they said, "Is this not just Joseph's son?" The question resonates through the centuries. How many times do we do the same thing? How many times does God speak through the common, the simple, and the despised? And we do not recognize it because we are waiting for something impressive. But here is the beautiful twist. What Nazareth rejected, a neighboring city embraced. Cana was only about 5.5 miles from Nazareth, a walk of perhaps 2.5 hours along stone paths between hills planted with olive trees and vineyards. It was a village even smaller than Nazareth, with perhaps 100 or 150 inhabitants, but it was there that Jesus chose to perform his first public miracle. Jewish weddings in the first century were not events of a few hours. They were celebrations that lasted for days, sometimes an entire week. The whole village participated. There was music, simple reed flutes, stretched skin drums, and voices singing psalms of joy. There was dancing, separate circles of men and women, arms interlocked, feet beating the dirt floor to the rhythm. And there was wine. Because in Jewish culture, wine was a symbol of joy, of blessing, and of divine favor. A wedding without wine was unthinkable. It was a social humiliation. The groom would never live it down. And at this wedding in Cana, the wine ran out. Mary was there, Jesus was there, and Mary, with that mother's intuition that knows her son's heart, said simply, "They have no more wine." Jesus responded with something that seems harsh on the surface. "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." But Mary was not offended. She knew the tone of his voice, and she said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." In the courtyard of the house, there were 6 stone jars. Each one was massive, holding between 20 and 30 gallons. These jars were used for water for ritual purification, as Jews washed their hands before eating, according to the tradition of the elders. Jesus looked at those empty jars, and he said, "Fill them with water." The servants obeyed. They filled them to the brim. Imagine the work. Each jar would need 20 or 30 trips to the well with heavy pitchers. It might have taken an hour to fill them all. And all the while, they must have wondered, why? How is water going to solve the problem of the wine? When they finished, Jesus said, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast." And when the master of the feast, the coordinator of the party, responsible for ensuring everything went well, tasted that water, it was no longer water, it was wine, and not ordinary wine. The master of the feast called the groom and said something surprising. "Everyone serves the good wine first, and when people have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine until now." He didn't even know where it had come from, but the servants knew. They had filled those jars with common well water, water that likely tasted like stone and clay, like all water from an old well. And Jesus had transformed that water into 150 gallons of the best wine those people had ever tasted. Why? Why start the miracles this way? Why not heal someone? Why not cast out a demon? Why transform water into wine at a wedding feast? Because Jesus was making a statement about who he is and what he came to do. Those jars of purification represented the old covenant, the rules, the rituals, and the external washings that could never truly clean the human heart. And Jesus transformed their contents into something completely new, into joy, into celebration, into abundant life. He was saying, the era of the law is coming to an end. The era of grace is beginning. And I did not come to bring more religious rules. I came to bring life, and life in abundance. Cana accepted what Nazareth rejected, and it was blessed. Both Nazareth and Cana shared something in common: architecture. The houses in both villages were often built over or around natural caves in the limestone rock. Why? Because it was practical. The Galilee is hot in the summer, temperatures easily exceeding 95 degrees Fahrenheit, and it is cold in the winter, especially at night when the wind blows down from the mountains. A natural cave offered perfect thermal insulation. Cool in the summer, relatively warm in the winter. Families excavated the soft rock with simple tools, iron pickaxes and wooden wedges that expanded when wet. They created additional rooms, storage areas, and even cisterns to collect rainwater. The rock became part of the house, serving as foundation and wall at the same time. And Jesus, who grew up seeing this, who perhaps helped Joseph build or repair these structures, used this image in one of his most famous teachings. He told of two men building houses, a wise man who built his house on the rock, another foolish one who built on the sand. When the storm came, and in Galilee winter storms come with terrible fury, with rains that turn dry ravines into deadly torrents in minutes, the house on the rock stood firm. The house on the sand collapsed, and great was its fall. But Jesus was not just talking about construction, he was talking about life, about faith, about what happens when the inevitable storms of human existence beat against you with full force. Sickness, loss, betrayal, death. Moments when everything you thought was solid seems to crumble. And the question that matters is, what did you build upon? On popular opinions that change with the wind? On wealth that can evaporate overnight? On your own strength that will inevitably fail? Or on the rock that never changes, never fails, and never crumbles? Jesus was teaching from what he knew. From the houses of Nazareth and Cana carved into the living rock, and he himself was that rock, the unshakable foundation upon which a life could be built and withstand any storm. But here is the beautiful irony. Nazareth itself, the city that rejected him, that tried to push him off a cliff, and that could not receive many miracles because of unbelief, that city was about to become one of the most important spiritual rocks in human history, just not immediately. First came centuries of being forgotten. After the resurrection and ascension of Jesus, the disciples scattered throughout the known world. Peter went to Rome. Thomas reached as far as India. Paul traveled across the Mediterranean. And Nazareth? Nazareth went back to being what it had always been, an insignificant village in a remote province of an indifferent empire. Decades passed. Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans in the year 70. The magnificent temple reduced to rubble, the city burned, hundreds of thousands killed or sold as slaves. The Jews who followed Jesus fled before the destruction, obeying the prophecy he had given. Many went north to Galilee, to places like Nazareth, and these early followers of Jesus did something crucial. They preserved the memories. They pointed to specific locations and said, "There was where Jesus grew up." That was the synagogue where he read Isaiah. This was the path he walked to Cana. But the Roman world did not care. The empire had its own gods, its own priorities. Christianity was a strange sect, sometimes tolerated and sometimes persecuted. Nazareth remained obscure, until everything changed with a man named Constantine, year 312 of our era. Constantine, a Roman general competing for control of the empire, is about to face his rival Maxentius in a decisive battle at the Milvian Bridge near Rome. History records that he had a vision, a cross in the sky with the words, "By this sign you shall conquer." Constantine placed the Christian symbol on his soldiers' shields, and he won. A year later, he issued the Edict of Milan, granting religious freedom to Christians. And then he did something unprecedented. The emperor of the civilized world became a Christian. This transformed everything. Suddenly, being Christian was no longer dangerous. It was advantageous. Churches began to spring up across the empire, and Constantine, wanting to honor the sacred sites of the faith he had embraced, sent the most important person in his life on an extraordinary mission. Helena was about 75 years old when she embarked on this journey. Imagine, an elderly woman born in humble circumstances. Some say she had been an innkeeper before becoming involved with Constantine's father, now Empress Mother of the most powerful man on earth, traveling thousands of miles to the Holy Land. She arrived around the year 326, and she visited every place mentioned in the Gospels that she could find: Bethlehem, where Jesus was born; Jerusalem, where he was crucified; the Mount of Olives, from where he ascended; and Nazareth, where he grew up. At each location, Helena ordered the construction of churches, not simple structures, but magnificent basilicas that declared to the world, "This happened here. This is real. This stone, this earth, witnessed God walking among us." In Nazareth, she identified the site where tradition said was the house where Jesus grew up, and she ordered a church to be built there. Can you see what was happening? The city that didn't even appear on ancient maps, the despised village, was being marked forever as sacred. The stones that witnessed Jesus' first steps were being encased in marble and mosaic. But the story of Nazareth was just beginning. Over the next few centuries, the city flourished as a pilgrimage destination. In the Byzantine period, thousands came annually. Pilgrims from all over the empire, from Armenia, Gaul, and Egypt, walked to Nazareth to touch the walls, kneel on the floor, and pray where Jesus had prayed. Then came the Islamic conquests of the 7th century. Nazareth passed to Muslim control. But even under new rule, Christians could still make pilgrimages and still venerate the holy sites. There were tensions, extra taxes, and restrictions, but the memory persisted. Then came the Crusaders. In 1099, Christian armies from Western Europe captured Jerusalem, and in the following years, they established a Latin kingdom in the Holy Land. Nazareth returned to Christian hands. The Crusaders were brutal in battle. We cannot romanticize the violence they caused, but they were also devout builders. In Nazareth, they erected a new church over the Byzantine site, larger, more elaborate, with Gothic arches and carved stone brought from the surrounding quarries. And although the Crusader kingdom eventually fell, Saladin reconquered the region in 1187. The churches remained as stone witnesses to centuries of devotion. Centuries more passed. Empires rose and fell. The Ottoman Empire controlled the region for 400 years. Nazareth became a predominantly Arab city, with a mixed population of Christians and Muslims. The old Crusader churches aged, some crumbled, but the memory never died. And in the 19th century, with the modern world awakening to archaeology and history, Nazareth began a new phase. Franciscans, who had guarded holy sites in the Holy Land for centuries, received permission to excavate and build. In 1830, they began archaeological investigations under the Crusader ruins, and they found layers, Byzantine, Roman from the 1st century. Each layer confirmed that, yes, people had venerated this site for nearly 2,000 uninterrupted years. And then, in the 20th century, came the decision to build something definitive, something that would declare to the modern world that Nazareth mattered. In 1960, after years of planning, construction began on the Basilica of the Annunciation, the largest church in the Middle East. Designed by Italian architect Giovanni Muzio, it incorporated the remains of the Byzantine and Crusader churches, but rose above them in modern concrete and stone. The basilica was consecrated in 1969. Today, it dominates the Nazareth skyline, a massive structure crowned by a dome in the shape of an inverted lily, a symbol of Mary's purity. Inside, at the lowest level, preserved under glass and surrounded by protective railings, lies the Grotto of the Annunciation. This is the cave hollowed out of the rock where, according to millennia of tradition, Mary received the visit from the angel Gabriel. Millions visit this site every year, pilgrims from every continent, Brazilians who cross the ocean, Filipinos who save for years to make the trip, Africans, Europeans, Asians, all united by a single conviction. Here, something happened that changed human history forever. And when you are there, standing in that grotto, touching the cold limestone rock, you realize something profound. Faith is not an abstraction. Faith is rooted in time and space, in specific moments when God invaded history, in real places where the eternal touched the temporal. Jesus is not a floating myth in some vague spiritual realm. He was born in a specific year, under the rule of Caesar Augustus. He grew up in a specific village with stone streets and limestone houses. He worked with real hands that held real tools. He felt hunger, thirst, and fatigue in a physical body that required food, water, and rest. And when he taught about building on the rock, he was not speaking in disconnected metaphors. He was pointing to the literal rock beneath his feet, to the houses around him, to the life he knew intimately. Nazareth teaches us this, that God works in the concrete, in the tangible, in the real. And it teaches us something more, that he chooses the despised. Think of the journey of this city, from a village so insignificant it didn't even appear in historical records, to one of the most visited pilgrimage destinations on the planet. From a place where people asked, "Can anything good come from Nazareth?" to a place where millions come seeking the good that transformed the world. God could have chosen Jerusalem as the cradle of the Messiah. He could have chosen Rome, Alexandria, any center of power and influence, but he chose Nazareth, purposefully, intentionally, because his message from the beginning has been, "I see what you despise, I value what you discard, I work through the weak, the small, and the forgotten, and I transform insignificance into eternal glory." The life of Jesus in Nazareth, 30 years of silence, of ordinary work, of days that must have seemed monotonous, was not wasted time. It was a time of formation, a time of complete incarnation, a time of God proving that he values every ordinary day, every simple task, and every person the world ignores. You don't need to be important in the eyes of the world to be important in the eyes of God. You don't need to come from some famous place to make an eternal difference. You don't need a grand platform for your life to have profound meaning. Nazareth proves this. For 30 years, God was there, and almost no one noticed. But those 30 years prepared the 3 years that changed everything. And today, when you walk the streets of modern Nazareth, a city of about 75,000 people, the largest Arab city in Israel, you see the layers of living history. The Basilica of the Annunciation rises majestically. Around it, the Arab bazaar teems with life, vendors calling out to customers, the scent of coffee with cardamom, freshly baked bread, olives cured in brine. Churches of various denominations dot the hills: Catholic, Greek Orthodox, Maronite, Anglican, mosques as well, for Nazareth is a city of coexistence between faiths. And if you climb to the top of the hill, where the Salesian Church of Jesus the Adolescent stands, you will see exactly what Jesus saw 2,000 years ago. The Jezreel Valley stretching to the south, green in the spring with wheat and barley, golden in the summer before the harvest. The mountains to the north marking the way to Lebanon. The vast blue Galilean sky. The view has not changed. The rock beneath your feet is the same rock that supported his feet. And in that moment you understand, the impossible happened. It really happened. God chose the despised. He inhabited the common. He transformed the forgotten into the eternal. And if he did that with Nazareth, what can he do with you? With your life that sometimes feels small, with your days that sometimes seem unimportant, with your dreams that others despise? The answer is written in the stones of Nazareth, preserved in 2 millennia of pilgrimage, declared in every basilica built upon limestone. God sees, God values, God transforms. The shoot that sprouted from the dead stump of Jesse, the watchman who guarded eternal truths in silence for 3 decades, the consecrated one who was set apart from the womb to change human history. It all began in a village the world forgot, and the world will never be the same again.